When we generally think about walking simulators, we think of first-person games. These narrative experiences are usually confined to that particular perspective for some reason, and it has basically stuck that way for years now. However, Little Orpheus is something that could essentially be listed as an example of a walking simulator, even though it is, strictly speaking, a 2D platformer. The reason that we could call something like this more akin to a walking simulator is the general minimization of inputs that the player has over the gameplay. Sure, there are a few instances over the course of the game where you have to make use of some level of skill, such as swinging from some vines while timing your jumps or sneaking through a specific environment to avoid enemies, but these elements are not particularly challenging and do not add much to the general experience. The main draw of Little Orpheus lies in its use of continuous narration. When we decide to make use of narration in a piece of media, it can be for a number of reasons. And it also will not always necessarily work out well. Not every narrator adds much to a narrative. For instance, the infamous theatrical release of Blade Runner included a universally panned voiceover narrator who lazily and sloppily explained things you could very clearly see for yourself. Later versions of the film saw the complete removal of the narration in favor of a more subtle form of storytelling. That subtle form worked wonders for that particular narrative. Not everything works with a narrator, basically. However, when it comes to a more irreverent narrator, one who goes against some of the conventions that you would expect, it can often serve as a phenomenal way of sprucing up a story. In Little Orpheus, you are trapped with a non-serious narrator throughout the course of the game's events. And this unreliable figure adds a lot to the overall feel and vibe of the experience. The way that Little Orpheus masterfully adopts a narrator character is from an external perspective. Some narrators are essentially thought-oriented additions to a narrative that are intended to add something. But some are written in such a way that they appear to be presented as if they are part of a kind of documentation of events. For instance, the narrator in something like Arrested Development sounds like he's the narrator in a documentary, who is there to assist the audience in understanding what they are seeing. And so his form of narrator feels like it has some narrative artificiality to it. He is not a part of the story, he's just commenting on the story. This is the case in Little Orpheus. The narrator, and there are actually two narrators, are not directly involved in the events that are taking place. Instead, one narrator tells the story and we play through what he is explaining. In the game, the framing narrative involves a sweet man who has been captured by the Soviets and put in front of a general, who questions him on how he lost an expensive piece of equipment. The entire game is his explanation to the general about the fantastical events that led to the loss of said equipment. He is there to recount what happened to him, and we are there to play through what he recounts. However, he is a very unreliable narrator. We do not know if he's telling the truth, but we get to play through his tall tales and enjoy them in all their ridiculousness. And they are ridiculous. When you argue that you lost a piece of subterranean equipment because you fell into the center of the earth and had to run away from dinosaurs and monsters, well, you may just be lying, but you also may not be lying. The fun of this kind of narration also lies in the banter between our defendant and the general who is pushing him to, tell the truth. The general does not believe a word he is being told, and we get to think to ourselves whether or not we agree with the general or if we stick with our guy instead. We cannot be sure whether or not he is telling the truth, but regardless of whether or not he is telling the truth, we are still playing his story. This means that regardless of whether or not the story is made up, we get to experience it. We get to experience the fun and joyous tall tales told by a man who is desperate to survive his interrogation. And the events in the background, in the narration, which is very unserious but also immensely serious in its repercussions, serves as the true narrative that we are following. We are essentially there to see if his stories can convince his superiors to allow him to survive this ordeal. The joy of it all comes through the silly narration. The use of cartoonish Russian accents, the constant back and forth between a potentially lying subordinate and his superior, and the earnestness of the story that is being told push this narrative forward. It also does not matter what the truth is at the end of the day. We do not really find out if he was or was not lying, and that is a preferable situation here. If we found out either option for certain, then everything would crumble. There doesn't need to be a big payoff for this kind of moment-to-moment narration to be enjoyable. The fun is in the journey over the destination with this kind of narrative. It is what it needs to be and nothing more. This kind of narration can be so effective when used well, as it is in Little Orpheus, that you may not even realize that the gameplay is not doing much to hold your attention. The gameplay ultimately adds nothing and is just an elaborate and beautifully animated and crafted bit of background setting to the real story that takes place within the narration. This kind of narration can make or break a narrative, depending on how it is used. And Little Orpheus is a great example of how to use it to fantastic effect.